And how do you do that?
Well, one of the ways, I think I told the story the other night, was I was having a difficult time with my father when he was dying.
Fathers, right.
Yeah, and he was, my father had been an alcoholic most of my life. Both my parents were, actually. My father was sort of a raging, angry, difficult guy, unpleasant. And as he got older and was dying of throat and lung cancer, that personality came up. He didn't even have to be drinking. You know, he could be abusive and nasty just because of the results of his illness. And I had taken a hiatus from graduate school to take care of him. And he wasn't treating me nicely, you know. And I thought, well, he's not showing any gratitude at all. He shouldn't act this way. And I went to see Ram Dass, who was living in San Francisco at the time. And I'm telling Ram Dass my litany of complaints about my father, and Ram Dass listens to all of it very compassionately. And then after a while, he looks at me and he says, I have it. I said, what? And he said, why don't you see your father as your guru? And I said, my father? That old so-and-so? My father, my guru? And Ram Dass said, who else could he possibly be?
No.
And so that flipped it, because you and I know, because we've spent time with great teachers, that that a guru's job is not necessarily to stroke your ego and tell you how wonderful you are. It's really to show you the places in yourself where you're stuck.
Right.
The stuff in us that's preventing us from feeling that inherent connection, that oneness that we all share. So my dad was doing that because it was my judgments about him, my mind saying, he shouldn't treat me this way, he shouldn't be like this, I don't like him this way. He's wrong, you know. All of those thoughts were what were causing me to suffer. Not his behavior, but my reaction to his behavior. So I changed, and I started to see that he was a great teacher, you know, and that every time he said something that got me upset, he was teaching me something. And then finally, I worked with this for about 3 years, up to the point that he died. And one night I remember going over to his house, and he was being abusive. And I just looked him in the eyes, and I looked at how uncomfortable he was and how much he was suffering from his illness. And I looked at him and I said, Dad, I love you too. And I really felt it. And when I said that, he relaxed. He'd been really tense and sort of ferocious, and he relaxed, and he laid back into his pillow. And I was standing next to his bed, and he reached his hand up and started patting my left shoulder like this. And he looked up at the sky, at the ceiling, and he was like looking at heaven, and he was going, good, good, good. And I had the feeling in that moment that I had just graduated, that it was, he was like saying, thank God, you know, the kid finally got it. Took 33 years, but he finally got that it isn't about how nasty I can be. It's about how loving he can be. And in that way, he really taught me so much about love and loving without expectation and learning in some way to incrementally move toward that thing we often talk about, which we call unconditional love. You know, but none of us think we can do it. But that's divine love. You know, that's love without expectation. It's just love because of love. You know, it's just love loving love.
Right. You know, I'm having another one of my psychic coinky-dinkies here, because I don't know what it is about New York fathers, but mine was like yours, mine with the same.
We had the same father.
I had maybe, I mean, my father was kind of only alcoholic for a little amount of time till he fell through a glass coffee table and said, I think I should stop drinking, my mother said. But he was a Sicilian. I don't know, what was like your father?
My dad was from Pittsburgh. He was Pennsylvania Dutch.
Yeah, Dutch, okay.
Yeah.
So they're kind of stubborn too. But my father was sort of Sicilian, a little bit the mafia. This is my house. I'm the king of the house. And we never got along. I mean, you know, and he was a pretty, you know, my mother and him, the whole, you know, abusive thing. And I grew up like, I can't take anymore, you know, I can't listen, I got to get out of here. And I don't know what it is, but I mean, what I want to ask you, between, like, in your background, between like kind of spiritual and psychological and therapist and how do we pick these fathers? Why did I pick him? Or did he come with my mother and I liked my mother? What is it? Because I really had a hard childhood. What happened, what drove me to India was when I finally graduated, he said, get out of the country. You know, the same thing with the Vietnam and everything. Because this was, actually this was 64. It was cut your hair. That's all he could say was cut your hair. Why are you a beatnik? Get a bath.
Clean yourself up.
If you don't like it here, get out of the country and don't come back. And he actually gave me a one-way ticket to Morocco, which I then kind of went all the way to India. I said, okay, well, I won't come back. And I never called him for 2 years. He told me to get out. So why is it, how did I get there? Can you see some
Well, it's probably more useful to look at it as how did you get here? You know, and what part did he play in that?
Yeah.
I mean, it's,
you know, see anything, you know, like from the time we know each other, and you have that kind of father. To me, maybe I grew more, I think, from having that kind of like boomerang experience than if I had the father I always envied that my nice Jewish friends had. Stable guy, did whatever the wife wanted, no arguments. My house was Saturday Night Fever and All in the Family put together all the time.
That's quite an image.
Oh, I'm telling you, yeah, it was. And the Bronx and Italians and guns. My father, once somebody moved a little fence around some tree he planted. He went up and got a gun. He was going to kill the guy.
Wow.
He was lucky, my father, that across the street there was a New York cop, a sergeant. You know, they lived in the suburbs. He ran over because the guy ran up his house, locked the door, called the Yonkers police. My father, the sergeant came over, took my father's gun, threw it in the Yonkers reservoir before the police came. You know, you have a gun in New York, that's life. That's how insane. My father could, the second sentence you argued with him, you could be dead. Because you can imagine living, I couldn't say anything. Well, you know, he'd just look at you, he could just, that was it. And I, you know, so I am like, have spent hours and weeks with therapists banging those pillows in the 70s, you know, and I mean, it's been like forever. And then I had, you know, Bodie B on, you know, who's from Maui. And he was talking about, you know, you have to kind of make peace with all these people before you leave. And I said, my father's not here. What do I do? And he said, well, you got to go thank him and, you know, do it in your mind. But I mean, like, why do we have to, what's the training? Why am I keep working on this? You know, I've got these issues like, and you know what, you're right. It's all about a relationship to something, somebody. Well, even the person in the office is a drag.
Well, if you could take your father, for instance, since that's such a potent relationship, and turn it around and see him as Maharaji in disguise. You know, now it's a really bizarre disguise because you never imagine your guru as a violent person with a terrible temper, you know, who's got a gun upstairs, you know. But if you can see it that way or see him that way, I mean, you know, it's an interesting point of dialogue because my dad did not like guns and he didn't believe in them, and he said I would never have a gun in the house no matter what. I think partially because he understood his own temper and his own anger. And there was a moment when I was 16 where I got so freaked by my father that if there had been a gun in the house, I would have gotten it and shot him with it.
Oh, you?
Yeah. Yeah, and it was interesting, and you know, I remember at the time I was horrified to see that in myself. But, you know, one of the things that Elizabeth used to say to us, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, she would say, before we can see the Christ in ourselves, we have to see the Hitler in ourselves. And we all have it. We all have the potential. I think that every human being under the right circumstances has the potential to go into a rage or to get so consumed with hatred and anger that all bets are off, you know, and all morality is out the window. And I found in my own being, until I saw that in myself, that really spurred me to want to find my higher nature, because that that dark side of me was so frightening, I didn't want to deal with it. It wasn't that I didn't want to deal with it, I didn't want it to take control. I did want to deal with it by not having it take control and by finding the higher thing that would supersede it. So you can look at a difficult parent kind of, I mean, sometimes I look at both my parents as beings who sacrifice their own happiness so that I could be happy, because I looked at what they did in life and something in me fortunately said, I don't want to go down that path, because look, it just made them completely miserable. And, you know, so that I've come to the point where I feel really blessed by having them as parents, and I feel thankful and grateful to them because I watched them suffer tremendously because of their addictions.
Yeah, you know, I'm having like two more flashbacks. One is when you said, you know, there was a gun in the house. I used to sleep with a knife under my pillow because I heard them arguing, and I said, I've got to protect my mother. I think he could kill her.
Right.
And the other was, I really feel sometimes that I actually ran to India and to Maharaji because I finally got some love from a father figure.
Right.
He just, whatever I did, he just, okay.
Right.
Maybe Ravi Das is crazy, or, you know, maybe, I always thought that Maharaji said to himself, you know, he would yell at other people and maybe throw them out of the temple, and I think he would sit there and say, Ravi Das has had such a hard childhood, I ain't going to give him any more shit. Do you think that's all, you know, me dreaming, or what do you think?
I think that your experience of it is valid. You know, it's your experience, and I'm sure that he knew what your experience would be.
Oh, right.
You know,
so I did some outrageous things. Ask Ram Dass, even to Ram Dass. I used to steal his pen, his letters, tell people I was Ram Dass in India. It was all this funny stuff. I thought he would, you know, he'd give me money, I'd give it away. So I mean, that's how I was. And then, you know, with Maharaji, I, you know, was a little naughty here and there. He never said anything, and everybody knew he knew everything. Right. Right? Like, you know, Ram Dass would say, I thought this, and Maharaji would repeat it.
Right.
I did these weird things. He never said anything.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah. He'd say, sit down and have some rice.
Right.
And I go, okay, that's over. Yeah, and I mean,
because all that behavior isn't who you are.
Yeah.
So you could turn that around and say all of your father's behavior isn't who he was or is, you know, and that you relate to him as you relate to Maharaji, and just say, well, you know, he was just a different manifestation coming through that probably, as you said, gave you the impetus to go to India and meet Maharaji.
Yeah.
So thank you, Dad.
I'm telling you, if we could all talk about our parents like John does, we'd be way into the game or out of the game. But
that took a lot of work. It isn't.
Yeah, it's a lot of work
overnight.
No, I mean, I'm still working. I'm working, working. It's like, you know what? You can't not work.
Right.
Yeah, because those relationships keep popping up, and people you meet, and the guy who, I think I'm going slow down the driveway, and he goes, slow down. I go, what the, you know? I got a problem with this guy already.
You're going New York slow. He's talking Maui slow.
Yeah, I mean, God. So, but I mean, you know, John has another book, and we want to get more information from John while he's here, because, you know, you're not going to get this everywhere. So we want to talk about awakening from grief.
Sure.
Finding the road back to joy is about the ways our society has sought to avoid grief, right? So how do we avoid grief?
Well, we have so many ways of doing it in America, you know. I mean, basically, you could say that the entire culture and the entire economy are based on how to avoid grief, you know, and looking outside yourself for happiness, so that from a very young age, we're taught that happiness comes from accomplishments, achievements, again from wealth, and being something in the culture's view. You know, I was fascinated in a kind of sad way about 10 years ago when we started talking about the fact that our youth had become so mesmerized by celebrity, you know, and that's what the aspiration really is for our youth, is to become someone who's rich and famous.